Ladies, let's move on to, the subsidy and how it's paid. NDIS, the NDIS model, it gets paid these days directly, to the recipient. How do you think childcare subsidies should be paid, and how should it work, in practice?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think if we touch on the NDIS, and at the moment the NDIS gets a pretty bad rap, but if you look at what the NDIS was fundamentally started for, it was to give people choice and control over who is providing their care. So prior to the NDIS, if you had a child born with a disability or you were a person with a disability and you needed support in your home, you received block funding that was given directly to a provider, which was not your provider of choice. So the government said to you, this is your care that you require that we have decided for you. Here is the person who will provide that care. And that person had little to no opportunity to change their provider, even if there were issues. So that was it. It was a blanket. You use this model, you use this carer, this is your money. What the NDIS has rightly changed is seeing the person as an individual who can make their own decisions and needs to have choice over who's providing their care. If you apply what is happening in the childcare centre with that same understanding and that same logic, we're actually doing the opposite to parents. So when we're saying to parents that, yes, you need to care for your child, yes, you need to go back to work, the only way we will help you do that is if you use this one model of care. So there is an argument to be made that what the NDIS has done for people has empowered them to have choice and control, to have independence, and to have that ability to pick the person and the provider who is giving them whatever type of care that they want. We believe that that should go to families and to children as well. And people with disability are a vulnerable group in our society. The elderly are a vulnerable group in our society, and arguably the most vulnerable group in our society is children. And we are not giving their parents that choice over the care that they receive. So what we're asking for is a similar but also very different model to the NDIS in using the current childcare subsidy as it exists. We're not asking for any change to the infrastructure of that. We're not asking for any change to the amount or the subsidy or the people who are eligible. What we're asking for is to have a new category within the childcare subsidy called family selected care. And that will enable all eligible working parents who are currently already eligible for the system to use a range of approved care providers of registered carers. So there is a level of registration and licensing and monitoring that needs to be done, quite rightly, because we are using $16 billion of taxpayers' money. We haven't at this point gotten to a full policy position where we know, yes, it should be paid directly to a parent and then they give that to a carer. What we're saying at the moment, which makes the most sense with the infrastructure that currently exists, is that a person, whether it be a grandparent, a nanny, an au pair, they become a registered provider. And through that registration, very similarly to what happens with the family daycare system in Queensland and in Australia, is that they are paid by the government as a registered provider.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Maddie, have you got any further insights there?
I think what Jen said at the beginning of that question was she was talking about, choice for parents. So in every other aspect of, the education journey for your children, be that primary school or high school or even, in healthcare, to an extent, you get a choice. You can try and find what suits your values or your family or your, circumstances, and the childcare subsidy as it is just doesn't give that choice.
Yeah, and I guess, getting back to, we referenced the NDIS earlier. The NDIS is broken in a number of ways. It was obviously set up with the right intent, but, a lot of people are claiming, NDIS subsidies, which really they shouldn't be eligible, a lot of people, and that's where the system's broken. But you can't argue with someone having a child and needing childcare.
Exactly. That's right. And I think there are obviously very large flaws in the NDIS that open it up for fraud. And of course, anyone who is attuned to those issues will also make the argument that paying a parent directly does open this up for fraud. There is already $2 billion worth of fraud a year in the childcare subsidy as it currently stands. And there was quite rightly, people will also point to the fact that a few years ago there was fraud was rife in the family daycare sector. But we ultimately, what we're saying is that there needs to be proper licensing, proper monitoring around this to make sure that there isn't fraud. And one of the ways that we're suggesting that is done is through having c- continuing the activity test. So at the moment, as today, for you to receive the childcare subsidy, you have to be either working, studying, or volunteering. We are saying that, and in January, the government is removing that activity test. So in January, there will be no requirement for a parent to be doing any of those activities to receive the childcare subsidy. They will receive 3 days of childcare subsidised guaranteed. We're asking, as part of our new category, for that activity test to remain. So if you want to hire a nanny, or you want to pay your parents or a family carer to look after your children, you need to be working, studying, or volunteering. And that's something that we've been really strong on in this policy, because we feel like we are using taxpayers' money. And this is their, parents are taxpayers too, but there does need to be that level of accountability if you are going to use in-home care, that you are using it to return to work.
Yeah, and any system is open to fraud, right? So people will always find loopholes and go, "Well, government, you've said this. Well, hey, guess what? I can go around this." Doesn't matter if it's childcare, NDIS, anything that's government funded. And then I do recall, years ago, that, there was this big push for basically paying parents not to work. Well, surely that can't be good for families or productivity either.
Well, some people will argue with you that parents staying home should also receive the childcare subsidy because they are delivering childcare. And that has been some of the feedback we have received during this campaign is that parents who stay home should also be eligible for the childcare subsidy because they are providing care to their children. We haven't gone that far with this petition, but when we were in Canberra, that was feedback that we received from a number of politicians that they would be open to doing that too.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, personally, I had a background with a single mother who, couldn't work because she wanted to, we didn't have childcare. There was no one to look after me. So she made the sacrifice to, stay at home and not work. But times are different back then as well. Like the cost of living wasn't the same.
Exactly.
I think you're a bit more open to letting your neighbours sort of keep an eye on you.
But I think in some of this conversation about, not this conversation podcast, but just more broadly about childcare and productivity, everyone's forgotten the original intent, and it was to facilitate people getting back into the workforce. There is a productivity measure for getting women back into work. We constantly talk about the gender pay gap, and everyone talks about women falling further behind on superannuation. And one of the ways to stop that is to allow them to get into the workforce. And that's why that activity test is so important.
Yeah, and childcare also is about education too. Is that right? Is there an education element to childcare, saying putting children into a childcare centre versus
I think it depends what age they're at, Todd. I mean, I'm not an educational professional, but certainly if they're having a kindergarten program administered through a daycare center, then there is a level of education. But I mean, you've got 2 boys, and my youngest is 1. I don't feel like when we're banging sticks on the table, there's a huge level of education happening. Um, you know, It's that's about the extent of the structure when my baby's at home.
I think there is a real point with that too when you apply that same logic to children. A 6-month-old doesn't need education, they need a carer, and they need to be nurtured. And when you look at what happens to a person's brain as they're born and what happens, so within the first 2 years of a person's life, but sometimes 2.5 years, almost all of their neural emotional pathways are formed. So what's happening to a child's brain is they're not learning their ABCs when they're 2. They're not learning any of those things when they're 2. What their brain is doing is developing how they'll react emotionally to a marriage, a divorce, a birth, an emotional activity when they're 40. So I've got a 4-year-old. How she'll react to those activities in her 30s and 40s is already formed. And that's what when you talk about education, children actually can't socialize properly until they're 3. So they parallel play. It may look like a child is sitting next to someone and they're playing a game. They're not socializing. What they're doing is parallel playing. So there are arguments around the word education and what that really means. There is research that points to children in low socioeconomic families and low income households. They may benefit from going into a childcare setting earlier than another family, but are we really in a place of a society where we're going to split people over income and education? I don't feel like that's a country that, Australia is. I think what we need to look to is what actually happens to a child in those first 1,000 days, and that is emotional development. And if you can make the argument of, for some children, childcare is very stressful and can be very upsetting and traumatic for them. And what is that doing to their brain when all they're forming in that little head of theirs is emotional pathways? We don't really know yet because we're the first generation to do this long-term, 5-day-a-week childcare.
And kids pick up on their parents' emotion too, right? Like if you've got a mum or a dad or, a grandparent even who's dropping their kids off at daycare and they're stressed about it, kids can pick up on it.
That was me.
Yeah. Yeah, true, true. I wanna keep going with the productivity piece, but, in your experience and research, how do other, let's just say, like-minded countries or countries with similar values to Australia, how do they undertake childcare?
Yeah, so there are a lot of in-home programs that run across the world, very similarly to what we're asking for. New Zealand has a great one. And the one that I point to a lot is the UK. So we follow the United Kingdom's currency. They're on our coins. We have their system of government. They're our head of state. We look to them for a lot of our policy decision-making processes through a program over there, which is run through Ofsted, which is their sort of department of care and in-home care and this same area and sector. They have an in-home care model where families can have subsidized care for a nanny. And how that works is the family chooses, they hire whoever they want to have look after their children. That person then goes through a national check. They have their police check done, they have their criminal history, their qualifications, and then they're issued with a register provider number. And that register provider number is very similar to how things run here with the family daycare system. And then they are paid as a provider by the government that subsidised amount, and the family tops them up anything that they're owed in terms of their contractual agreements of what they've agreed to pay per hour or per week to that carer. So the other place that obviously we all talk about being amazing with their childcare is all of the Nordic countries, and they all have in-home care models where families can be paid to hire a nanny. In Paris, in France, they get paid to have nannies. So this is not an uncommon practice. It's something that families are asking for across the world, and I think that it would be great if Australia can catch up, particularly with what the UK is doing. It's very similar to what we're asking for.
And we are a very multicultural country, so it makes absolute sense to, bring the best of other cultures over to us. There's a family I'm friends with at school, and they've just come back from Singapore, and she's got 4 boys, and they've, madly just started renovating their house, and she said, I don't have anyone to help me anymore. How do I juggle it?" Because she said, over in Singapore, they've always had live-in help.
Yeah, and the multicultural element is really interesting as well. We've heard from a lot of different groups across Australia during this campaign. One of them is obviously Indigenous Australians who It's a very, sensitive issue for them, and the feedback that they've given us is that they want, that kinship care and that family delivered care because that is how their culture runs, and that's what's important to them. And the other feedback we've had is also from Italian families, where when we were in Canberra, one of the politicians said to us, "I come from an Italian family, and if you use childcare for a lot of Italian grandparents, that means that you may have failed as a parent. That should be the grandparents." So when you talk about multicultural society, in which Australia by definition absolutely is, how do you how do you allow all of those cultures to thrive and to continue to run the way that they want to and that they should in their cultural realms and that kinship care? And that is to give them choice.
Yeah, it's like aged care, right? It's that cradle to grave piece, like, it's almost like we outsource it here in Australia, whereas other cultures and other countries, it's all done in-house. Like, when you're born, when you get to an old enough age, you're looking after your mother or your grandparents, and it all stays within that, and that does help build, family values and culture. Yeah, which is really important. And I guess, speaking of family values, the Productivity Commission's framed childcare as central to national productivity, and projecting cheaper childcare could enable 61,900 more children to access early education, 7,500 odd parents to join the workforce. But what does get lost in the debate, it's only, it seems to all be about economics, not family values. How do we get the lens back onto family values?
Yeah, and so with those numbers and that productivity commission, what that is talking about is the proposal for universal childcare. So how that will happen is the government will need to build 160 more childcare centres, and they're projecting that won't happen until 2036. So those numbers, they only speak to the fact that we need a universal childcare system. In the government's idea is 160 more childcare centres by 2036. That is a long time away. My children will be in high school by the time that happens. Or that, Todd, your children will have finished school by the time that happens. How do we help parents right now? Because parents who are locked out of the system, they can't wait till 2036. They need something today. And that's why we've asked for. But on your point of family values, I think that is the most important thing in this entire conversation is we often talk about childcare providers, childcare workers, the unions who represent them, the money, the taxpayers' money, all of those things are, and they're important in the conversation, but we're missing the most important stakeholder in this, which is children. And young children, children under the age of 5 who they can't speak for themselves. For some children in childcares, they can't even talk yet. So we need to protect them, and that is ultimately what all parents want to do, is to protect their children and to raise them well, and you that's how you judge how well you're doing as a parent, right? How your kids are going, and that that comes down to empowering parents. That is what this ultimately needs to do, is the government needs to empower parents to have more ability to have that choice over who's looking after their children. And for that to happen, it needs to be fair for all parents, not just about, rich people with nannies. It's got to be for all families, because if it's not, it just creates more problems as well. So those family values, I really believe, need to be front and center to protect children. And the way to do that is to empower their parents.
Yeah, no one cares more about their kids than their parents, and no one knows more better what their needs are than their parents, and we've got to be able to trust parents to make the right decisions for their kids and for their circumstances and for their family. They are at the center of it. Parents and children need to be consulted on these changes more broadly.
Mm. And one thing to consider too is that, obviously in a childcare setting, you're not necessarily able to pick the person who has that direct contact with your child for
Yep.
that first 1,000
Yep.
days, right? They're in there with a whole lot of other kids, a whole lot of other carers, so on and so forth. And that, whereas, as I mentioned when I grew up, it was just my mother looking after me. or in other cultures, grandma's looking after you, so that's instilling the family values, not just family values, but behaviours and learned behaviours that you want your child to carry through life. And I wonder if there's a direct correlation with, I guess, the behaviours we're seeing in this current generation of kids, whether it be, from my observation, there just seems to be, a different level of, I guess, community participation, respect. Criminal behaviour seems to have gone increased, not across all kids, obviously, but in certain communities with kids who are obviously left behind because they've got no one to really guide them. Because who knows who's looking after them? And you see all the issues in childcare centres recently with certain bad behaviours from certain people. But I just think, that family culture, and instilling those values in children at that early age is so important.
Sorry, I jumped in, Jen. There's a podcaster and an author and a man that I follow quite religiously, Dr. Billy Garvey, and he, in a show that he brought to Brisbane recently, he talked about the adults that kids need in their life, particularly before they're 8. And he said you need a male and a female in your life who aren't your parents, like an extra person, and Todd, your kids are getting close to those teenage years, and I can't say I'm looking forward to dealing with all of that stuff. But when my kids are older, when I've ruined their life by not letting them go to a sleepover or something like that, I want them to have another person they can call. And I think if that's someone who has been in there, caring for them and understands them intimately, like having their grandparents more than, the monthly lunch, whatever it is we have with them, I want them to have an adult in their life they can pick up the phone to and say, I've got the worst mum ever, and I want them to have someone else they can talk to, and maybe that is the carer that's been around for them, and it's got to be someone that understands, our household and what we value as a family too.
It's really important. There's 2 things I wanna touch on there, Maddie. One, you're following another podcaster, so you're cheating on me. I don't know how I feel about that. Um, secondly, I guess that's been the role in Christian society, is the role of godparents, and it's so important. And I've got that relationship with my, some family members as well, especially, an 18-year-old niece. When she was off to schoolies last year, it's like,
Exactly,
"Don't call your mum and
exactly.
dad if you get in trouble, call me first."
Mm,
Then,
mm.
and she's got the confidence to do that,
You're not gonna
because
dob,
you know that you've
yeah,
got their back, and you're not hiding anything from mum and dad. No, but you're there to sort the problems out, and, someone that, because like you said,
yep,
mum and dad at times can
mhm,
be the worst in the world. Don't I hate mum and dad and blah, blah,
yes,
blah. Yeah, mum and dad are
yes,
just trying to give you the guidance to get you through life,
absolutely.
but it's the message versus the messenger piece as well. Ah, well, so ladies, last one on policy. The current policy seemed to reflect, narrow ideas of productivity and how it's measured in workforce hours rather than that broader view that includes, thriving families. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's an important question, and I think that's potentially what this whole debate is missing, right? We're not talking about families, we're not talking about kids, we're talking about how we funnel more money into childcare providers, and that that's hard as a parent. And I think just going back to what we spoke to as well, if you as a parent, we're all scared about teenage years, and the other thing that is really hard is being a mum is hard. Being a parent is hard. You constantly are questioning the decisions that you make for your children, and am I making the right decision? Is this the right thing for them? It's what my friends are doing, but is it the right thing for my children? And that you don't currently parents aren't feeling supported in being able to make different decisions because they can't. It's a choice of going to work to earn an income, to pay a mortgage, to pay rent, to put food on the table, which means putting your child into childcare. But if they don't put their child into childcare and they don't go to work, what does that mean? Do they lose their house? Do they, lose their income? Can they pay their car payment? Families are stressed, and families are under a lot of pressure financially, but mums and dads, but mums really do feel that guilt of making these decisions as well. If we want families to thrive, we really do need to empower them. And one of the ways we can do that is by giving them more choice about how childcare works. for them.
And I was gonna say, and like Jen said, parents are stressed, and being a mum is really hard. And I remember before I had my first, I worked quite hard to have my kids. They didn't come easily. And after I had my first, I thought, that's it. I've spent 3 years trying to have this baby. I'm going to stay at home with him. And he turned one, and I thought, oh, I'm kind of missing my job, and I'm missing the workforce and the social aspect of it. And the fact that at the time I had grandparents, my mum and my husband's mum, that could look after my son for me 1 day a week. And they both moved heaven and earth to make that happen and juggled their own jobs at the time because neither of them are old enough or have enough money in the bank to retire. But that juggle, it just made my life so much easier, and it meant that I came home happy. I'd had you know, my go at joining the workforce and being productive and having some adult conversations. And I think there's a lot to be said for mental health too. I had that day away where I got to be me again, and I came home a much happier person for my family.
Yeah, and I think that, yeah, the other thing is, and like Maddie's experience is different to someone else who they're really happy staying at home. They get so much reward from being a parent, and that is something that's really important to them. And for parents and mums at the moment, we get so much crap. You get judged whether you have a natural birth or a cesarean. You're judged whether you breastfeed or you formula feed. You're judged whether you have your kid front facing before they're one in the car. There's so many things we give mums crap for. We can't make childcare another one of those things. You can't judge parents for wanting to, like Maddie, wanting to return to work and having that be something that gives her personal reward and gratification and something that she really needs, compared to a mum who wants to stay home or wants to do some volunteering or wants to have, work on her own business that she's starting in her garage. Those mums can't be pitted against each other. And if we head towards a universal childcare system, I'm really scared that that will happen. That if you aren't someone who uses the $10 a day childcare that the government is proposing, that you'll be a bad mum, or, you'll be the mum that's outcast. And that that can't happen for mums. We get so much crap as it is. I think we need to really be empowering all mums to make decisions, and one way the government can do that is obviously to give them that choice.
That if I had $1 for everyone every time someone said to me, "Oh, you haven't put your kids in daycare, they're not gonna have any social skills," I'd say, "Well, you know, I take them to the park and I take them to the grocery store, and, no one talks more than I do. They're not gonna have a problem with their social skills. I didn't need someone to be criticizing me for my choices."
Yeah. I mean, and you often think about, I guess the last piece on policy and government being, we're investing all of this money in an AUKUS program, which might give us some capability in 50 years' time. Yes, we need security, but
You say education for children, and for children, they have to be going to this education center where they're being taught by a professional. Well, when you have a baby, you don't get given a certificate 3 in childcare. That's not, we don't get given a manual at all on how to look after this little person. So why can't, and it goes exactly to Maddie's point about socialization. Parents are able to help their kids socialize. I can teach my kids the ABC because I know the ABC. They don't need to have that happen outside of a home for a lot of kids. And when we're saying to parents, well, you can't educate your children, it almost feels like you're not a good parent. Oh, I don't have a certificate 3, so maybe I'm not putting my child into childcare and therefore they're missing out. So I think we need to acknowledge that parents will ultimately, for the most part, most of society, do the right thing by their kids. And like Maddie, she can socialize her kids. I can socialize my kids. They don't need to go to childcare. And that conversation around education can sometimes be offensive for people when you think about it. It is almost personal in saying, well, if you don't have this certificate 3, you're not the right person to educate your children before they go to school. It's
it's tough.
Yeah, it
You
is
can't win.
laughable.
You can't win.
No.
Ladies, let's talk about the road ahead. You're obviously doing a lot of work with, in Canberra and at state level as well with MPs and departments. But do you think a flexible parent-directed, system can actually drive efficiency and better outcomes?
We do. Yeah, we really believe that this could make a massive difference in terms of economic participation, in terms of productivity. And it's really simple. If you think about the fact that families could hire someone to provide in home care, those people who are providing that in home care, they then earn an income. That income goes back into the economy. It's pretty that parent goes back to work. We know that there are statistics from the Centre of Independent Studies that say that 46% of working mothers would say they'd work more if they had flexible childcare. We know that, 66% of those mothers also agreed that they would prefer to use subsidies on an alternative care and that they would actually take a lower subsidy if it meant that they could have in-home care to then be able to work more. So it's simple in the terms of there are parents who are already saying this. Maddie and I are sitting here. We're not rare. We're saying we would work more if we had access to more models of alternative subsidized care. So I think the answer is pretty simply yes, more flexible, and that parent directed system would have positive economic impacts, but also, as we've talked about so heavily in this podcast, for the family as well.
Well, I was gonna say without really getting into the weeds too, having for me, and I can only speak to my experience. I have an au pair, and she doesn't just care for the kids. My 1-year-old still naps for 3 hours a day, which means that during those 3 hours, I can work, and she can make dinner or put on a load of washing, and stuff like that just makes a huge difference to my family's quality of life. It means that I don't spend all day Saturday catching up on washing. You'd think there was 20 people in this house. The amount of washing little kids go through, as every parent would know, but it means that, we can then spend our weekends, we can take the kids to the park and we can have a really nice, time as a family unit on the weekend because we are not stressed and we are not constantly playing catch up because we've got a model of care that works for our family and for our household. And certainly once you've got multiple children, it makes even more sense because of the productivity and the money.
Yeah, yeah, and that makes so much sense. I mean, you talk about all of those extra tasks that need to be done around a home, and we talked about different cultures, like, some good friends of ours are Albanian, and there's the kids, there's the mum and dad, and there's both the grandparents. Well, everyone chips in and does stuff so that because they're all in that one family unit, whereas 90% of us don't have that, and you are and then you add a different element like single parents or parents with a child with a disability. They get no downtime. They get none of that quality family time that is so important for building good families. So, I guess, ladies, what would success look like for your movement for parents? Is it pilot programs, a full policy shift, or is it simply opening the door to greater choice?
Well, we're open to all of those things, but we're certainly not going to say no to a pilot program. I think for us, what is really important in whatever the government of the day who decides to take this policy up is that it's open to everyone. A lot of pilot programs have been run in the nanny space before. However, they have failed because they haven't been open to a broad range of people. So for us, it really is ensuring that that model of who is already eligible for the childcare subsidy remains eligible for a pilot program. We would love to see a full policy shift where a government or an opposition looks to endorse family selected care as part of the childcare subsidy. And the sooner the better because parents need immediate action now.
Absolutely. Sooner the better, like Jen said. There's reports saying that people are having less children, and this is probably one of the reasons why. Kids are expensive, and juggling this kind of stuff is not easy with childcare and different kids needing to be at different places. So the sooner they can do this, the better it's going to be for workforce productivity, getting mums back into the workforce, and even helping the aging population.
Yeah, and then we are getting older, aren't we? That does changes a whole lot of dynamics. So, that's really insightful. There's a lot of stuff in there that I didn't even realize, to be honest
Have
with
you
you, and
signed our
as a
petition
parent,
yet, Todd?
having been through it a couple of times. It would Well, I was just gonna ask you, how can listeners, add their voice or share their stories, and where can they sign a petition to support what you're doing?
Yeah, so our petition is on change.org, but you can find it through our newly launched website, which is forparents.com.au. So for parents.com.au. Or you can follow us on Instagram, which is at forparentsau. And please, we would love as many people to sign as we can. There's, as everyone knows, in every sector of the workforce, there is strength in numbers. So the more people we have signing, the better. And if you agree, make sure you get your wife or husband or partner or parents, your whole household to sign. That would be, yeah, really beneficial to our cause. And if you have a story that you would like to share with us, please do. We are using stories in every element of conversations we're having with government, with the media. So we would love to hear from people as to how this would help them. And I'd also really encourage anyone who does have a story that they would like to share, or an idea around childcare or support for this issue, to potentially put in a submission to the Senate inquiry, which is currently running into the childcare sector. So there is a Senate inquiry which has been started that we have been invited to participate in as an organisation, but all people can participate in the Senate inquiry and put a submission in about what they would like to see in the childcare sector moving forward.
Yeah, I was gonna say, and on that, democracy, write to your local MP as well. We've got a template letter on our website. Go directly to them, tell them what you think. It is their job to be your, advocate in the parliament, so tell them what kind of changes you want.
That's wonderful advice. Look, wrapping up, Jen and Maddie, if there's one thing you could say directly to Prime Minister Albanese and the responsible ministers in Canberra about childcare policy, what would it be?
Well, the Prime Minister has been very open about saying he wants childcare policy to be his legacy. We believe that we are giving him an excellent policy idea that would change generational care in our country, and we would love for him to support this idea to give parents more choice.
Absolutely, it's time to modernise the childcare system.
That's a good slogan right there. Ladies, that was awesome. Is there anything else you'd like to go over or talk about? Or I thought that was so good.
I think we've covered it.
No, thank you for having us.
Oh, but look, you guys are awesome. That really was so good. Even I, even though we crafted some questions, there's a lot of stuff in there that I didn't, a lot of detail that I
Thank you,
wasn't,
Todd.
fully across. So that's amazing.
Yeah, and it's sort of that sector that the more you look into it, the more angles you find.
That was Madeline and Jen, the team behind the For Parents Advocacy Group. A reminder that productivity isn't just about GDP, it's about how we empower families to work, live and thrive on their own terms, not the government's.